One of the One of the things that we didn't get a chance to cover last week on utilitarianism was act and rule utilitarianism. And one of the things I want to make sure that you're clear on, because it's going to come up again. It's going to come up again on this quiz.
Yeah.
And it's going to come up again on the midterm. So I just want to make sure that you guys are clear and that all things are well. So your author talks about this idea that there are times in which—
Can you tell Auntie Connie I love her? And
one of the things that our author talks about is that there are these things that maximize our happiness, right? Remember, we talk about utilitarianism, talking about the maximum happiness for the maximum amount of people. And that's kind of where the focus is. And this is kind of the development of Mill's writing. Singer adopts that later on, Peter Singer. And those who are proponents of utilitarianism today will continue to support this idea. One of the things is that act and rule utilitarianism is this version in which we find that we ought to act. Utilitarianism is that we ought to consider the consequences of each act separately.
yeah.
That's the important thing about act utilitarianism, that each act has to be considered separately in order for you to distinguish and estimate the consequences. Before you came on, Deidre, we were kind of talking about how, in terms of motive, action, and consequences come. I can have a motive that's a good motive in my mind for whatever it is in terms of my ethics. I can have various actions, and my various actions can complete a whole cascade of different consequences. In act utilitarianism, it is telling us that we ought to consider the consequences of each act separately. So if I determine in a case that say, for instance, if I determine that I am going to stop Medicare, okay, as an ethical thing to stop the debt ceiling, and I support the fact that we should no longer have Medicare, bump the fact that these people have paid into this all these years, we're just gonna stop the program, okay? And so that you who continue to pay into this, you'll never get it. And the people who have paid into this all these years, who've had it, they won't get it anymore. So one of the consequences is that the people who now are, who have Medicaid or Medicare will not get the medical care that they need, right? That's one of the consequences. Another consequence of stopping that program is that your money is still coming out of your check every time that you get paid that's going to Medicare care, but you'll never get any benefit from that in the future. So you'll never get that back. That's another consequence. So I've got to look at all of the different acts that are coming from this particular motive separately. So that's what considers act utilitarianism, that I have to consider the consequences of each act separately. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And then
every reaction, or it's not always, it's never going to be the same.
No, it's not. And so, and sometimes when we think about, just acts, motives and acts and consequences, we're thinking about, well, it's just one consequence. Well, no, there's going to be a consequence for every act. And even though this particular motive may be for the good, because we don't want to raise the debt ceiling again, because, now the country is going to owe more and more and more money. But, how do you get off of this? How do you get off of this merry-go-round without all of these other consequences coming out? Then rule utilitarianism states that we ought to consider the consequences of the act performed as a general practice. And what do they mean by that? And this was the example that was given in one of the earlier renderings of this book. And she talks about that Sue is considering whether or not to break her promise to go out with Ken, right? And she believes that if she breaks the promise in order to do something with her friend, that Ken will be unhappy, but she and her friends will be happier. According to act utilitarianism, if the consequences of her breaking her promise is better than keeping it, then she ought to do it. That's act consequences, right? She may use the rule of thumb to help her determine what's keeping or breaking the promises, or breaking it will result in the consequences. Mill calls this direction points along the way, or honesty is the best policy, right? What actually does is that what Sue has done is she has broken the promise to Ken, but because it results in the greatest amount of happiness for her and her friends,
Right.
act utilitarianism, yay,
Okay.
consider the consequences of the particular act as keeping or breaking one's promise. Got it?
Yeah.
But rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, works to the point where she would consider what the results would be if everyone broke promises and broke them in similar situations. So if everyone always made the decision as a rule to break promises whenever they wanted to, what kind of standard would that be? That is the difference between rule utilitarianism, because as a rule, should we always be making promises and breaking them all the time?
No.
I don't make
So-
promises. I can't.
Okay.
I just said, I will do my best, my very best,
Mhm.
because I don't, if I have to break it, then I don't feel right within myself.
Mhm.
But, even my daughter, when she was little, she said, "Mommy, but you promised." I'm like, "No, I didn't." I said, "I will do my best."
But actually, that's good in the fact that you're saying that, because that in a sense is rule utilitarianism, because as a rule, you don't make a promise.
Mm-mm.
So
And if
it's
I
not a
do, I gotta
promise
make
for
sure I
you to
come through
break.
with it.
Right, it's not a promise for you to break. So utilitarianism, so you're seeing the concept, considers the consequences for some practices as a rule of behavior. Your rule of behavior is to not make that promise in the first place. And so in Sue's situation, her practice is to not to break promises. Your rule is to not make promises
Right.
so that you don't break them.
Exactly.
So that's the difference between act utilitarianism and rule.
Okay.
Utilitarianism.
Got it, guys?
Yeah.
And good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Why easier?
So when you look at question 18, then you're having to look at what it's characterized by. and actually understand that you're talking about utilitarianism is characterized by the rightness of an act, by the appeal of the relative rule of morality. When you're talking about the rightness of an act, it's just it's the act that is that you're appealing to the rule of morality. You're breaking the promise in Sue's situation. She's like, I'm appealing that. I'm overruling it. I'm like, whatever, I didn't want to go out with Ken anyway. So I'm not going out with Ken, didn't really care for Ken. So I'm breaking the promise to Ken. It didn't matter that he had reservations tonight, and I called him at 7:30 and we were supposed to meet at 8. And, I had a better opportunity with my friends. So that's kind of how that works. And so that is why I wanted to make sure that you all understood that, since I didn't get a chance to finish that idea. And I did ask you all to read it, but I wanted to make sure that you all understood it. Okay?
Yep.
All right. Any other questions? And I'm going to go on and stop the recording again. And then I will take